Hi everybody, welcome to Leading for Life Stories Season 2. My name is Bob Judson and I'm your host for this podcast, and I'm absolutely delighted to have you here joining me. Thanks very much, and I really hope you enjoy what follows. Just before I launch into this week's episode, a quick plea for some support with the podcast. For the past year and a bit, I have done this without any form of membership structure or financial support at all. And I think it's about time I actually changed that. So what I've done is on Patreon, I have created 3 membership tiers to ask for you to consider supporting me. If you value the content I provide, if you think it's been useful to you, if you enjoy it, then I would be really grateful if you would consider just getting in and making a small financial contribution per month on the basis that it helps keep the podcast going. There are costs obviously associated with this, various subscriptions and software and hardware and all those sorts of things that I have to do. So that would be massively appreciated if you are so minded. All you need to do is either find the support the show link, which will be in the notes on your podcast platform of choice. That will certainly take you there. Or alternatively, go to www.patreon.com. That's patreon.com /leading4 and that will take you there. So www.patreon.com /leading4 and you should find it, and that will give you the option of either becoming a supporter, a champion, or a patron of the show, and all the details are there. Please do consider it. I really would appreciate your help, because it just makes it much easier to continue doing this show. Thanks very much indeed. Off we go. Welcome back, everyone. In the last episode, I continued talking about my time as commanding officer at Royal Air Force Coningsby, and I thought this week I would continue that same story with part 3 of a series of episodes. And this time I thought I'd talk about building the Typhoon Force, because that was obviously central to my role at Coningsby for the 2 years I was there, and for my successor, and actually ongoing his successors, really, in terms of building and maintaining what is the RAF's mainstream frontline capability now. It's the biggest single fast jet force that the Royal Air Force has, and it was literally a case of from little acorns mighty oak trees go, because where you look at the aeroplane now versus where it was when we started, it is quite extraordinary, really. And that's quite a long time ago. I mean, I was at Coningsby 2004 to 2006, so 20 years ago exactly, really, that we were in the position of really starting in anger to build up the force. And I'm going to talk separately about flying the Typhoon and actually my experiences of doing that, because I think that's worth an episode in its own right, to be honest. But there's so much to the journey that we took the aeroplane on, from its early days at Case White, as we called it, where it was a factory enclave up at BAE Systems Wharton with a few aeroplanes doing some operational evaluation flying alongside industry, to moving the aircraft down to Coningsby, and then building up the capability in my time to the brink of, but not quite making, the QRA, Quick Reaction Alert declaration, and then onwards in my successor's time to achieve both air defense and ground attack combat ready declarations for the force. And in overall capability terms, of course, it hasn't stopped there. It's grown massively as an aeroplane in terms of what it can do, and I'll talk more about that in the episode as we go through. We began pretty simply, though. We had 17 Squadron was the operational evaluation unit. We had a few aeroplanes, I mean, literally 3 or 4 initially, building gradually as they delivered us new aeroplanes to start going alongside industry at Wharton. And it was very much a case of, right, what have the test pilots done? Where do we go next? How do we actually start thinking about bringing this airplane into active RAF service? What are we going to have to do to build all of the building blocks of an approach that trains people on the airplane and then actually allows them to fly and fight the aircraft? So development of initially a training syllabus, obviously, but then also the tactics manual and everything that went along with that, which was a huge task. I mean, really shouldn't be understated in terms of the amount of effort that was required, not least because this was an airplane like nothing we'd had before, really. There was no match to the capability that anyone could see in the Air Force. We made heavy use of people who had flown exchange tours on fourth generation airplanes, so typically F-18s, F-16s, etc., which had been highly maneuverable, highly capable, fly-by-wire, sophisticated weapon systems, high performance, and all that made a real difference in terms of being able to turn around and go, okay, this is how we did it there. What can this airplane do? How can we bring some of that capability into what we're now doing with the Typhoon? And that was a vital part of taking those early steps to move it forward. But there was also a very big engineering dimension. This was a totally new type of aircraft in terms of the way it was put together and the way the avionics were working and the nature of the way we managed the paperwork even on the aircraft was largely electronic. We had an electronic system rather than a largely paper-based system. And so for the engineers too, there was a big learning curve. And actually early days, building how we actually service this airplane appropriately, how we maintain the right records, how we ensure that everything is done properly and straightforwardly in a way that moved it from a kind of world where you're dealing with a prototype kind of capability that you need to actually turn around and bring it up to the mainstream. So it's easy to use, operationally easy to use, and ultimately deployable and fully capable as you need it to be. So that was a huge series of steps that required a lot of thought and a lot of input from all sorts of people. And actually, from a leadership point of view, it was a really interesting challenge because one of the things we successfully did was bring in people from a whole range of different experiences on the engineering side, on the flying side, and leverage that experience. We really wanted to tap into what did they know, what had they experienced, how do we now input that into what we're doing. So rank was largely irrelevant to that. It was more about what experience do you bring here, how can we turn around and capitalize on that and get us to a place where actually we need to be. 17 Squadron was the first plank on that particular bridge. And very quickly after that, we moved to starting and building an operational conversion unit, which was obviously the training hub that still exists today to bring pilots up to speed on the airplane and get them prepared to go to the front line. And that was also the moment at which we brought the aircraft down from Wharton and started to decouple ourselves from industry directly, although we still had a very heavy BAE Systems presence at RAF Coningsby, and to this day, that's still the case in terms of depth maintenance and things. So they stayed very, very tightly linked to us in terms of what we were able to do. And I started at Coningsby as the station commander in November 2004, and it was about April when we brought the aeroplane down the following year, so April 2005. And that was obviously a big moment. We're shifting everything from Wharton, where we had a kind of relatively safe haven with industry right on the doorstep, to bring it down to Coningsby and start operating it ourselves. And we really needed to take that step to be able to turn around and walk effectively, step out and take our own baby steps and start learning how we were going to operate. In those early days, we had quite limited capability with training aids, so there was a big aspiration for much more sophisticated simulators and so on downstream, and that's largely come to pass. But in the early days, we had much more basic training aids to look at. But what we did also have was all the early airplanes were two-seat, so they were all the tranche one, first tranche of the aircraft build, and they were all two-seaters, which meant that obviously you could do stuff developmentally with two pilots in the airplane, talking to each other, working out, playing around with it, having a go and experimenting with all sorts of different things. And that included things like fine-tuning the startup procedures and the checks that we needed in place in order to get the airplane airborne and operate it in the air and then bring it back again. And it sounds silly, but there were all sorts of things. This is a very heavily computer-based airplane, fully fly-by-wire, very electronic right through its being. And so we ended up learning very quickly that one of the things you could do if you were having faults on startup was we literally just depowered the entire aeroplane, left it for 30 seconds or so, and then repowered it again and went back through the same sequence of checks. It was called a depower repower. It was actually a formal part of our process at that stage, and it really made a difference. It was just like if you imagine your home computer, boot it, reboot it, and often it cured the problems because there was so much software integration and things that had to happen in the right sequence that it didn't take much to trip over itself and give you some sort of no-go light that was going to cause you a problem. And so it's those kind of things that were really, really interesting. And then building a conversion unit syllabus to turn around and go, okay, we now need, in typical fashion, the way that works on most conversion units is you obviously do a conversion phase. You learn to fly the airplane and get in it and do initially what we did was some duels, and then obviously you go solo, and then on the back of that you start doing dual checks for things, and then going into solo flying. Actually, fairly quickly after my time at Coningsby, but fairly quickly after that, they moved into a world where they did less and less stuff in the two-seaters early on. The simulation capability became really good. And also the airplane is essentially very simple to fly. It's a really simple airplane to start it up and to get it going, and also to actually get it airborne and do its basic operation. There are very few checks. There's quite a long emergencies checklist if things go wrong, but the normal checklist is really pretty straightforward. And so starting it up and just getting airborne with it was a very simple undertaking, which meant that it was possible to turn around and say to people, right, you've done your simulators, you understand how this all goes, and now just get in the airplane and go. And they started using the two-seaters for the more complex sorties where there was a lot of radar work involved and those sorts of things that inevitably took more time, particularly for people who weren't familiar with radars, to get them up to speed. And that was helpful where you had somebody else in the air who could help you out and potentially develop your capability at a much faster rate. So all of that evolution of capability was going on my watch and on that of my successor to turn around and think about how do we do this well. And then beyond the conversion phase of the syllabus and on the conversion unit, you very quickly move into various phases of fighting the airplane. And that includes learning how to use the radar and being able to do that effectively, doing intercepts, and a whole different range of types of intercepts, low-level ones, high-level ones, low-speed ones, high-speed ones, all sorts of different things that were going on there. And then also close fighting the airplane, combat, both in singleton combat, 1v1, and then 2v1, and building up to when you get onto the squadron to doing bigger things where you're actually we're moving from intercepts initially, moving into the merge, as it's called, where you actually end up in a visual fight, and then you're carrying on with visual combat. And we had some challenges to overcome, I suppose, in the early days with that, because this was an airplane that was, in its early days, capable of just over 8G, and it's now a 9G airplane, almost instantaneously. So if you literally pull the stick all the way back, it's going to give you its maximum performance. And in most flight regimes, that's going to give you instantaneously its full G limit. And that was not something we were used to with previous airplanes we'd had. Tornado had fly-by-wire, but it was a different kind of mechanization. You would still, you could probably avoid having overstresses, but you didn't have that level of performance where you could go from literally 1G sat in there straight and level with 1 times the force of gravity on top of you to throwing it into a turn, pulling back on the stick and turning it in excess of 8G in less than a second. That has all sorts of physiological implications that you need to overcome. Fortunately, the anti-G equipment that protects you, that you have a pair of G trousers that inflate and squeeze the lower part of your body. We wore our life jacket was also a counter pressure vest that squeezed your chest because you had a positive breathing system that when you pulled more than 7G, what it did was put positive pressure in through your mask to basically inflate your chest, if you like, against the counter pressure vest, all of which massively, massively helped with your G tolerance to stop your blood draining away from your head and effectively you then graying and or blacking out. But operating an airplane and learning to operate an airplane tactically like that was definitely a challenge in terms of, right, what can we do? How do we build the building blocks, if you like, to make safe progression, particularly for people who were coming from, and most of our pilots were coming from the Tornado F3, the Jaguar, the Harrier forces predominantly. And so there were single-seat pilots in there, but there were also two-seat guys from the F3 force. So they had to learn to fly single-seat without anybody else in the in the airplane, and that's a different operating challenge. But the Jaguar and Harrier guys, obviously, we didn't have a radar, so learning to operate the radar was also a huge thing, and is an absolutely integral part of an airplane like the Typhoon. So it made for an airplane that was easy to fly, but very, very difficult to operate well. And I think that still remains the case. It's a very high demand airplane. If you're working in full on operational environments, certainly what you see now with the airplane as they operate it over Iraq and Syria and so on very regularly still these days, then the challenge with the multiplicity of weapons they have, the very complex air environment they're operating in, the very challenging and high scrutiny rules of engagement environment mean that the pilot workload is probably higher than it ever was, never mind being easier. But it is helped enormously by having an airplane that is intrinsically quite easy to fly and quite difficult to do stupid things with. I mean, the joy of a fly-by-wire system in the Typhoon was if it didn't like what you were doing with it, it would just not do it. And so you could do some really extreme maneuvers. And we did train and start practicing in combat and so on to think about, right, how can we do things that would be unthinkable in most airplanes that we'd flown previously? And what would the airplane do? Was that tactically advantageous in terms of the maneuver you were going to get from it and so on? And all of that was the work of a combination of the operational evaluation unit and also on the conversion unit, where they were regularly looking to push the envelope a little bit, see what the airplane would give you and how it would perform, both at very low speed and at very high speed. It's impossible to overstate really how impressive the performance of the Typhoon was, particularly in its early days for those of us that had come from airplanes that just simply didn't have that performance. I mean, the Lightning, which had been around, was still around at the very early days of my operational time, but in its sort of final throes, was renowned as a very, very high performance airplane. It was essentially two big engines with a guy strapped on top, and was an absolutely amazing fighter from the pure performance point of view. But its weapons capability and its fuel limitations were enormous limitations. The Typhoon was just totally different to that. It was a Formula One car of an airplane that was just quite extraordinary to fly. And from the very first moment you got in it, powered it up, felt you sat very high up. You had a beautiful cockpit that, particularly in the single seater, when we got single seaters, you could look over your shoulder and literally see the fin and check your own 6 o'clock and look around the back of the ejection seat. And when you went out and you took off, if you did a performance takeoff, so a full power takeoff in afterburner, it was just the most extraordinary experience. We were flying typically at that stage with a couple of captive missiles, so missile simulators for both AMRAAM and for ASRAAM, so advanced medium range and advanced short range air-to-air missiles, and a single centerline fuel tank. And so we had, with that configuration, a pretty light airplane that the aircraft was very, very high performance engine thrust to weight ratio from the get-go. And you would line up on normally in most aircraft, certainly the Jaguar, which was completely the opposite in terms of performance. It was a very underpowered airplane. We would always never waste runway. Would line up right on the piano keys and you make sure that we were using making the full length of the runway available. If you did a performance takeoff in the Typhoon, you lined up beyond the arrestor cable, which used to be about 1,500 feet into the runway. So quite a substantial amount. That's, Coningsby had an 8,000 foot runway. So suddenly you're taking away 1,500 feet of it just because you wanted to line up beyond the cable so you didn't burn it when you rotated the aircraft at it, because the takeoff roll was basically only 1,500 feet, which is just extraordinary. It was taking you to from zero to around 150 knots in that incredibly short distance. So you were properly thrown back in your seat the moment you put the burners in as you let the brakes off, and your head was pushed right back and you were accelerating at an astonishing rate. And then when you rotated the aircraft, you literally rotated it to 75 degrees nose up, and the seat was raked back at 15 degrees. So you are now going 90 degrees up. It felt like you were going straight up with the airplane actually climbing away 75 degrees nose up. And that was just astonishing to be able to do that. And it would go to incredibly high level. It was cleared to 55,000 feet in those days, and also to Mach 1.6. And it would get both of those really, really easily. In fact, if you got airborne in military power, dry power, so without the afterburner, which we used to do routinely just to save the fuel as much as anything else, then would get airborne, would hold about 5 degrees nose up until you basically hit 400 knots, which was the end of the runway. And then you went to 20 degrees nose up in a dry power climb in order to climb out. And again, that was, for a Jaguar pilot, that was just the most extraordinary feeling, because we just never, ever, ever had that kind of performance. And it was just wonderful to be able to operate an airplane that was so potent in terms of what it could actually do. If you were careless with it at lower altitude and you didn't have the nose high enough in full dry power, it would go straight through the supersonic Mach limit, and you'd go through Mach 1, drop a sonic boom. We had that happen a few times, a few difficult explanations for locals in the area of Coningsby when we did it. But it was kind of almost inevitable, because the airplane just had so much power and performance, and was also, couple that with its carefree handling was extraordinary. And again, I'll talk more about that when I talk about my own flying experience. But the net result was we talked very quickly about the Typhoon grin, because anybody that flew a sortie in the Typhoon, for a start, every day was a sunny day. You would always, no matter how bad the weather was, you would find the sun if you wanted to. You could get up above, because the weather is never up at 50,000 feet. So if you really needed to, you'd go up there and you'd find blue sky and you'd find the sunshine, even if you're coming back through a lot of weather on the way back down. But just the sheer performance and the joy you got from flying the airplane was just extraordinary. And so, all of us, you'd get out at the end of every sortie, even if the sortie had been difficult, challenging, it had been hard work, and it was a really tough learning curve, you just couldn't escape the pure pleasure of flying the airplane. And we used to literally come out with a grin a mile wide when you got out of it. And that was something everybody got very, very used to. In terms of overall capability, we were lucky. I mentioned previously in my Group Captain Typhoon role that we'd had the Typhoon export program to Singapore, which was ultimately unsuccessful. We didn't sell the airplane. But what we had done was learned a lot about the airplane in that time. And that was really invaluable experience to set us up for the deployment kind of aspects and some of the things around air-to-air refueling and just the engineering and maintenance side, which had given a lot of reassurance and confidence that even at the very early days, with a very fragile, brand new capability, it was still able to do things that were frankly quite surprising. So that was really good in terms of what we were able to do. And it meant that we were able to start thinking quite quickly about, how do we take the airplane away to other bases? How do we start showing it to the rest of the Air Force? Because it had such high performance, we needed to turn around and go and do practice diversions to all the other airfields that would potentially operate into, so they could see it, they could see what it was doing, and they could get used to the very high climb rates. For example, when air traffic control were giving us permission to do something, they had previously worked with airplanes that had much, much more sedentary performance, I suppose. And therefore this was something they needed to firmly learn, that Typhoon had a very different approach. If you said climb to 20,000 feet, it was there in the blink of an eye, as opposed to taking a number of minutes to get up there. And that was clearly something that was important. We also changed a lot of the tactics quite early on, because even through up until the Gulf War I in 1990, we had predominantly been a low-level Air Force. After that, in that Gulf War and in some of the flying we'd done subsequently, we had done a lot more work at medium level, but we had still done an awful lot at low level. The Typhoon is an airplane where it's built around its radar and its missiles in the air defense capability, which was what we were focused on at that stage. And if you stick at low level, of course, you dumb down all of those capabilities dramatically. So it meant that we needed to think about how much time were we spending at low level versus how much time we were actually spending at high level. And that was a challenge. And it was a leadership thing for me where I basically said to the guys, look, you need to think very hard about this because there's no real point, apart from doing some of the things like visual identification of low, slow targets that they still needed to do. There was no real point in doing anything like the volume of low flying we had done previously, coupled with the fact that actually flying at low level meant that you inevitably used an enormous amount more fuel than you did at a high level, and that was obviously not a good thing. So all of that made for a big mindset shift for the pilots and the engineers on the squadrons. We had some really high caliber people. We were able to properly empower them to turn around and think broad. What's going to work best? How can you actually turn around and develop tactics? We had regular meetings, obviously, and a system for inputting thoughts, ideas, problems that people had experienced with the airplane to turn around and try and very rapidly develop it to get to where we needed to be in the fastest possible time. 3 Squadron was the first operational squadron that was built with the Typhoon Force at Coningsby. Very proud moment for Wing Commander Lowell Bennett, who was the first squadron commander on 3 Squadron. When we stood up that squadron, because obviously that was the beginnings of a proper muscular force. Weren't just a training outfit anymore. We're now building a proper force. And 11 Squadron followed them not terribly long afterwards. They were well and truly on the way to being built before I finished. And I flew regularly, luckily, with all of them, apart from 17 Squadron. 17 Squadron's airplanes were always in kind of different technical state. They were always with different software loads and so on. So I didn't fly with them. I flew the ones that were under my command, which were 29, 3, and 11. And I thoroughly enjoyed doing the flying that I was able to do with those. But as I said, that's a story for another day. I think it's really important to say before I close this episode, though, that we were the first relatively short chapter, 2-year chapter in the Typhoon's life. And here we are 20 years on with an airplane that is the backbone of the RAF now, that has a wholly different capability in terms of what it can do, both in the air-to-air role and in the air-to-ground role, and on the same sortie routinely that they're doing that. So proper swing roll airplane, very complicated for the pilots to pick up all the nuances of all of those roles and be able to employ the airplane to its full potential in genuine threat environments where they're having to really earn their corn. I was lucky enough to fly again in a Typhoon in the very sort of twilight of my Air Force career in around 2013. I flew with my old squadron, number 6 Squadron, which at that stage had become a Typhoon squadron. And that was a great privilege to get airborne in the airplane again and just see how far that capability had evolved, because it was massively different to when I had flown it. And that was really joyous to see that the development we'd started and the journey we had started off on was continuing and still continues to this day as they constantly develop, constantly evolve. One of the things that the Air Force is tremendously good at is learning from all experiences, good, bad, and ugly, and taking the best from those and moving forward and harnessing what you need in order to continue to develop well. And it's just so immensely satisfying to see that it has gone so well along that route to get us to the capability we now have in the Air Force today. That's probably enough for now on this episode. As I say, I'll come back and talk more about my own personal experiences with flying the airplane probably in the next personal stories episode that I do. But for now, I really hope you've enjoyed this. Feedback, as ever, would be really, really welcome. If you're able to support the podcast, that would be really, really welcome as well. You'll have had a little snippet on the front end of this episode that talks about how you can do that. And I would be really chuffed if you would do it. I have had my first Patron level sponsor. And so, Dahlia Garwood, I am immensely grateful to you. Thank you very much indeed. That is a great start. And I hope that I'll have many more as things progress and we go forward, because that makes it an awful lot easier to continue to do this and justify the time and the expense of putting it all together. But I hope you've enjoyed it. Thanks very much. See you next time. Bye.